Recording is going on. Okay, then. So, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our distinguished lecture series this week. So, this distinguished lecture will be given by Dr. Frank Lee. Frank is an assistant professor at Gatech, Georgia Institute of Technology, and he has joint appointment in School of Cybersecurity and Privacy at Gatech, and also the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Frank works primarily on data-driven understanding and improvement of internet security, and he uses a number of fantastic approaches, including internet measurement, user studies, and software analysis. Frank's works has been quite impactful and covered by multiple, like both popular media and very well received in research community. In fact, his research has received two Best Paper Awards, one SCM IMC and another one is Unix Soups. And his work has been funded by NSF, DARPA, industry partners, among others. He is also one of the researchers who identified Heartbleed attack that affected OpenSSL library that almost everyone of us used for HTTPS connection. So we are really excited to hear his talk. So thanks, Frank, for joining. And without further ado, I am giving the mic over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Manak. And hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here talking with folks at IIT Kharagpur. I think it's, I was just talking with Manak earlier, I think it's beginning of your Friday evening there, so I really appreciate you taking a part of your Friday to join. So as Manak mentioned, my name is Frank Lee. I'm a assistant professor at Georgia Tech. This is actually my second year here. And today I'm going to talk about system administrators and why I think they're a very important population to study when it comes to security and privacy context. And some of the work that I've done over the last few years on catering security for this particular population. So I'll start off at the beginning by saying that I'm happy to take questions throughout the talk. Also, I'm not going to go into a lot of the low-level nitty-gritty details of these studies. So if you want more information, I'm happy to answer any questions or talk afterwards. So let me start off with kind of a 10,000-foot perspective. So when we think about computer security and tackling it, we typically think, especially coming from the computer science background, of a lot of different technical aspects. We think about, finding security vulnerabilities and bugs, how to remedy them or patch them, how to defend against attackers getting into our systems, as well as kind of building secure systems from the ground up. So this is kind of like the classic areas of computer security that we typically think of when we first think about security. But I think over the last couple decades, there's been an increasing recognition and respect in the community that security is not just a purely technical aspect, but there are a lot of other social technical considerations that come into play. I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but there's economics, there's law, there's policy. But one of these facets I do want to touch on is user behavior. I think one of the things we've learned is that a lot of security problems are enabled as well as driven by how users behave. And I threw up just a few representative papers here that the research community has looked at in terms of user behavior, whether it's how users use cryptographic systems, how they engage with permission models, as well as how they respond to warnings and different authentication systems such as passwords. So over the last decade, especially, we've seen like a really large growth in this subfield of usable security or kind of human factors in security. Now, when we kind of look at this field, this is really interesting work and it's really impactful work. But one thing that I, at least, one kind of insight I draw from this is that we tend to focus on one kind of population, which I'm just going to call the end user population. These are your typical users, your average folk that are using their own devices, maybe a couple of devices for kind of their own purposes. But there are actually a lot of other important users out there that have different operating conditions and are also important for various other reasons. So I'm going to focus on a subset of them today. So today I'm going to talk mostly about administrators, but I did want to highlight that there's a ton of other user populations, such as security analysts and developers, as well as other end user populations, such as vulnerable populations, populations across different age categories, different kind of living environments, rural versus urban, that I think are really interesting to study as well. But today I'm going to focus on system administrators as a specific subpopulation that I want to argue is really important and really interesting to actually investigate. So why are they actually important? So when we think about system administrators and system operators, one thing to recognize is that they really have a lot of broad responsibilities. Like administrators work for organizations where they have to manage the computing system and the computing infrastructure for those organizations. And as a consequence, the actions that they make can heavily impact the security of that organization, as well as any other users or customers that engage with that organization. So as a result, with administrators, they've got basically a lot of responsibility and high impact in what they actually do. So this is why I think they're a really important population. If you think about typical end users, if an end user suffers a security problem, it typically is more constrained to them or at least their immediately surrounding environment. But with organizations, the impact of some administrator actions could actually have really large societal consequences. Now, why are they an kind of interesting population to study, especially from a research stance? I think it's because they're actually very unique compared to end users. So on one hand, they face a unique array of threats. With end users, you obviously face a lot of different security and privacy threats out there, and administrators face all of those threats too, but they also face a lot of the threats that are unique to organizations. For example, the typical end user doesn't need to deal with a massive denial of service attack or deal with like large scale ransomware attacks or authentication issues from the server side. So administrators have to deal with a lot of different issues compared to end users. They also have various operating conditions that are very unique. For example, in many cases, they have a lot of resources available to them that may not be available to other populations, but they also have to operate under certain constraints. Like, for example, when you're part of an organization, you usually have some kind of management or organizational structure there that you need to adhere to. There's also policies, compliance, and different standards that you have to stick to. So this actually adds a lot of different constraints to administrator operating conditions as well. And then another aspect that I think is very interesting, especially from the research perspective, is that in most cases, these administrators are quite technically proficient. And I say typically because it kind of varies and it somewhat depends on the type of administrators we're talking about here. But what this does is it opens the door to potential solutions or potential defenses that may not be actually usable or effective for end users, but could be effective for administrators. So I think this is a really important and interesting population to study that has unique conditions that we can leverage for kind of trying to better protect them. But overall, in the security research community, in terms of the literature, there's been significantly less emphasis on operator security compared to end users. I think this has changed over the last few years. There's actually been a lot more investigation into different kinds of operators, developers, and analysts. And I think that's been a really interesting trend over the last few years. But overall, if you look at the bulk of work, it is primarily focused on end users, and rightfully so because they are the dominant population, but these are really interesting and important populations as well. We can see some of the consequences when administrators do security or privacy issues kind of incorrectly. I just threw a few headlines out here. I'm sure most of you have probably heard of the Equifax breach that was caused because of a failure to patch a security vulnerability there. But there have been countless kind of other cases where major security incidences at organizations kind of stem from some of the actions or inactions in many cases of administrators. So I bring this up to highlight two things. One is that their consequences of their actions are really important, but this also highlights that there's still a need to improve how administrators manage security. It's not the case that they're already really great at this and there's no problems, but we see time and time again that there must be challenges out there with how administrators are managing security, and when issues go wrong, they can have really big consequences there. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
So I just have a quick clarification question. Are we talking about the administrator or the developers, like the software developers? The reason is that there is some work on software, like understanding the, like in the recent years, but I would say that for the last 5-6 years, there's some work on understanding the developers, like security preferences, like how the crypto, how they use crypto libraries and so on and so forth. But are we talking about like those people, or are we talking about administrators like the network admin, whoever is updating our software, whoever maintaining the code bases and the systems and so on?
That's a great question. And my answer is going to be a somewhat of a cop-out, and I'll say I'm actually, at least the start of this work and most of the work that I'm going to talk about today focuses on administrators, like network administrators, the people managing the systems, rather than developers. I tend to think of developers as a different subpopulation. But the cop-out is that a trend that we've seen over the last half decade in industry is this notion of DevOps, where it's kind of a merging of multiple roles, where you have basically administrators who are also developers of kind of the infrastructure that goes into place there. So you actually have kind of overlap between the different populations here. But when I think about administrators, I tend to think about, especially for the context of this talk, I tend to think about the people managing the system, that are updating that, trying to patch it and keep it secure and kind of configure it correctly. But in many cases, they're actually developers as well. But that's a really good question.
Right. I mean, and the one reason is that perhaps just to actually even for this and interesting tidbits for others also. So I guess the thing is that what Frank's Heartbleed Gatech has shown in 2014 was that OpenASL, which is a really great and really well-used library, is actually developed by 3 people. All of them are volunteers. Like they are not, and they have all day jobs. So they are both developers as well as maintainers of that software, like very important software base. That's why I was a bit. I just wanted to clarify whether we're talking about softwares developers or this. But thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, and that's a good comment. It's not a point I was going to touch on, but yeah, it is actually kind of scary the extent to which a lot of our critical infrastructure in terms of software is actually based on kind of the volunteer efforts of a small set of people. But yeah, so today I'm going to focus more on administrators that are actually managing systems for different organizations. So not so much the developers creating the software, but rather those who might be running the systems that are using that software today. Okay. All right, so today I'm actually going to cover like a slice of my research that looks at administrators and their security, and it kind of boils down into 2 main groups of works. The first is trying to understand the behavior of these operators, and this is through various techniques to measure their behavior at scale, through doing user studies with administrators to understand how they actually do certain things, their process for handling them. As well as, and this is going to be both for kind of what I'm talking about first today, which is remedying security problems, as well as kind of dealing with authentication. So that's kind of like the first slice of the work. The second part is to actually take insights from that empirical work and try and look at kind of operator-centric solutions. And this will include some socio-technical approaches for informing administrators about problems that affect their systems, as well as how do we harden some of the systems that they use or some of the defenses that they use to protect their organizations. So today I'm going to start off, and for the majority of the talk, I'm going to focus on a set of studies that kind of touch on several different topics about essentially fixing security problems. And depending on how we're doing on time, if I can get to it, I'll try and get to some of the more recent work I've been doing on authentication aspects. All right. So the first set of works I'm going to talk about all touch on this notion of internet scale administrator security notifications. And so that term might be a mouthful and a little hard to understand exactly what that means, but let me try and clarify. So let me start with some motivations here. So one thing is that as a security community, we're actually quite effective at finding a lot of security problems and finding who's affected across the internet at scale. So we've got a variety of different tools, such as internet-wide scanners, such as ZMAP and MassScan. We've got all sorts of web crawlers that can be used to crawl the web at scale. And we find every year thousands and thousands of security vulnerabilities. So we are able, as a community right now, to find these security problems, use these tools, and figure out who else out there is actually affected by the problems. And this is why we have, thousands of vulnerabilities and hundreds of papers every year about these security problems. Now, we often kind of stop there, though, once we find the problem. Well, ethically, hopefully most people report the security problems to the vendors, but then we kind of just stop there. We hope that the vendors will push out a fix and that people will eventually at some point update their software so they get that fix. But the motivation behind this kind of line of work is can we do something better to get people to actually fix these issues? We can find them already. We know that they're vulnerable. Can we actually do something to try and directly influence them to actually fix the security problems? So this is where this line of research goes after this problem with a social technical approach, or kind of factoring in some human aspects. Why don't we notify the administrators? Let's let them know that, hey, you've got a system that's vulnerable. You should probably fix it, and this might be how you should tackle the problem. Now, at a high level, these kind of security notifications, it might sound really simple. It might just sound similar to kind of typical end user warnings, so nothing terribly special about it. Very simple process. But when you actually think about it in a little bit more depth, it turns out it's actually pretty tricky. There's a lot of questions about how do you actually do this notification process, especially at an internet scale. So there's a variety of questions that pop up once you start to think about actually executing administrator notifications. So for example, you found some system on the internet that's vulnerable. How do you find a contact for that? Who do you actually reach out to, and how do you reach out to them? And what sort of communication medium do you reach out to them on? When do you actually contact them, and what do you actually say in your notification itself that will clearly explain the problem and actually incentivize them to fix the problem? So there's a lot of different elements here about how do we actually execute the notifications effectively, and they touch on a lot of human elements here. So through a series of works, because really, before this work, as a community, we had very little understanding of whether these administrator notifications would actually have any effect. In fact, many people just assumed that no one would ever respond to notifications, so they're never going to actually fix a problem, even if you told them about it. That was kind of like the assumptions coming in, but through a series of studies, we've actually kind of systematically explored how to do administrator notifications. And I should be upfront in saying that this work is still kind of ongoing. I don't think we have all the answers yet, but I'll tell you what we've done so far. So across these studies, we've looked at different aspects of the administrator process and tried to systematically understand how to do effective notifications. I'm not going to talk about each of these individual studies in depth because there's a bunch of them and they all vary a little bit in the details, but I'm going to kind of up level and combine them all together in this kind of discussion. So just at a very high level, these notification experiments in general are a systematic way of investigating notifications through controlled experiments. Now, each of the individual studies that I showed above in the previous slide have a lot of variations, but at a very high level, the general structure of all of these controlled experiments are we find some method for detecting a security problem at scale, such as using ZMAP to probe the internet for vulnerabilities such as Heartbleed, which Manak mentioned earlier on this talk. And then this allows us to compile essentially a list of hosts across the internet that are vulnerable. Then we have to figure out a way to reach out to somebody that's associated with that host. So we need to explore the question of who to contact for these affected hosts. And we'll talk about different ways that we explored finding out contacts for vulnerable or affected systems out there. Then the experiment goes as follows. It's actually a pretty classic controlled experiment where we split the contacts into two groups. One will be a control group that we monitor, but we don't notify, just so we can see as a baseline how much is this issue or the security problem being resolved just in the background. But then we have a test group where we actually send the notifications and then we monitor them as well to see if our notifications are able to drive a significant level of remediation after the notifications. Through these kind of different control and test groups, we can actually explore a variety of different variables about the notification, such as who we should contact, how do we contact them, when do we actually contact them, and what do we say during the notification process. And then at the very end, what we're ultimately trying to answer is whether these notifications actually were helpful or not. So this is kind of like the high level structure of all of the different controlled experiments that were kind of covered in the previous slides papers. Okay, so in terms of what are the security problems that we study, or what are the security populations, there's a variety that we've covered across this body of work. So they kind of break down into three main categories. One is a set of vulnerable websites. So we have the Heartbleed bug, which was a big, massive, kind of really public vulnerability that affected a lot of web servers out there. We also looked at kind of classic web vulnerabilities such as cross-site scripting, as well as some exposed information on these websites. And just for the sake of time, I'm kind of skipping through all of the details of how we actually did these measurements. But essentially, at a very high level, these combined ZMAP scans, so internet-wide scans where you can actually send probe packets to essentially every single IPv4 address across the entire internet, as well as using large-scale web crawling to crawl a bunch of websites and do security assessments. So vulnerable websites was one category. Another category were the compromised websites. So this was an interesting project that we did in collaboration with Google. Particularly, Google has two teams, safe browsing and search quality, that do large-scale crawling, of course, but they also can find out websites that are demonstrating indicators that they're actually compromised. And these sites could be distributing malware or doing phishing or distributing web spam. So this is a project where we worked with them in finding these large populations of compromised websites and exploring notifications to see if we could get people to fix the compromise. Then a final set of hosts that we kind of experimented with across these studies are different sorts of misconfigured systems. So this includes kind of IPv6 firewall misconfigurations, industrial control systems that basically control a lot of power plants and electric grid and kind of a lot of physical infrastructure there that really shouldn't be publicly accessible on the internet, as well as HTTPS kind of TLS misconfigurations. And for these, we also did internet-wide ZMAP scans to find the firewall problems as well as the exposed industrial control systems. And we did a separate collaboration with Google, with the Google Chrome team, to work on HTTPS misconfigurations. So this is kind of like across this body of work, we've looked at a variety of different security problems because naturally notifications might exhibit different behavior depending on the context that you're notifying about. All right, so we've got a bunch of different security problems and a lot of affected hosts to notify about. We also want to know how best to do this notification because it's not as simple as, oh, you just send a message and you're done, but how do you actually send this message? There's a lot of different elements there that can affect the message's effectiveness. So through these studies, we all did randomized controlled multivariate experiments so that kind of similar to, say, medical experiments, we can actually have different sorts of treatments, different notification methods, and observe how those different treatments actually differ in terms of the notification response. So when it comes to who or where we should reach out to the contacts of systems, we looked at a variety of different options. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, there's a system or a protocol out there called Whois, where you can associate emails with IP addresses, with domains and such. Over the last few years, I should mention that the usefulness has degraded a bit due to some of the privacy laws that have been enacted, but they were actually all after this body of work. We also looked at mining emails out of websites as well as forums. There's a lot of organizations out there called Security Emergency Response Teams, CERTs, that can kind of have purview over managing the security of a large number of other organizations. And there are also kind of standardized email aliases that many people should have, ideally, that we could try reaching out to. And then we also did some experiments with social media, with even calling people, as well as sending a physical mail to them to see if they were affected. So there's a variety of different contexts that we explored reaching out to the administrators of affected hosts. We also did experiments about what to actually say in the message in terms of the presentation. So one natural question is about the level of detail. For example, if you provide too much detail, it might be overwhelming, but if you don't provide enough detail, it might not be enough for the administrators to actually take action. We looked at other kind of elements such as the format or the tone of the message, as well as whether including references or links would help, and whether, especially because we're doing internet scale notifications, whether language translations would actually be useful in trying to overcome potential language barriers. In terms of timing, there's kind of really one main thing that we've looked at, which is whether repeat notifications actually are effective. Like if we notify them and they don't clean up or don't fix the problem, should we notify them a few weeks down the line? So these are some of the different variables that we've kind of explored across this body of work. And then by doing these kind of controlled studies, we can actually analyze the effectiveness of notifications from kind of two different perspectives. The first is from the network measurement perspective. Because we have this ability to actually leverage our detection methods to monitor the systems over time, we can see actually whether they fix the problem or not. So by doing these large-scale measurements, we can actually compare the remediation behavior for the control group versus the different treatment groups and identify which treatments were most effective, if any at all. One interesting thing that we can also do is because we are able to monitor this large population, we can look at different demographics here. Not so much of the administrators themselves, but of the systems. So for example, if the systems are hosted in certain geographic regions, if they're using certain types of software, we can actually look at these different demographic characteristics and identify whether remediation correlates differently across different demographic characteristics. So this is the network measurement perspective, and this ultimately tells us what actually happened to our notifications. Did people actually fix once we notified them? But there's a second kind of other aspect, since this is a very human-driven process, we want to understand also the human factors that are involved here. If it was effective, why was it effective? And if not, like what were the problems that might have arisen? So we, throughout these studies, have also looked to understand the experiences of the notification recipients. So this includes kind of engaging with recipients through the notification responses, as well as distributing surveys with the recipients so that we can get feedback about our notification process and get some insight into how they tackle remediation there. All right, so this is kind of the setup for everything. We've studied a variety of security problems as well as a lot of variables about the notification process and looked at network measurements to understand whether they're effective, as well as engaging with the administrators to understand kind of the human elements there. So let me actually just summarize some of the key results. And of course, there's a lot more details in the papers, and I'm happy to answer any questions if folks have any. So probably the most pressing or the most salient question is whether these notifications are actually helpful at all for the security problems. So here I'm going to show a graph that actually combines results from all of the different studies earlier. So on the x-axis, we've got a variety of the security problems, all of the different security populations that I discussed. And on the y-axis is going to show the percentage of the vulnerable systems, the vulnerable hosts that actually fixed within 2 weeks. And for each of these security problems, I'm going to show the control group as well as the best notification group, because in some of these studies, we have multiple treatments. I'm going to show the best treatment for that particular category. So this is actually what we observed across the studies, and you can see quite a lot of variation there. So in general, though, one kind of key takeaway here is that across the board, we see that the notifications did actually drive a significant amount of remediation for all different cases. And in fact, in every single one of these cases, the difference is statistically significant. But that doesn't mean it's actually practically significant, though, because you can actually see, for example, on the left side, when it comes to hijacked hosts, as well as the Heartbleed vulnerabilities, we see significantly stronger response compared to other vulnerabilities or misconfigurations, where there, not even a quarter of the hosts fixed the problem, even when we notified them. So I think this ultimately highlights that there's kind of consistent impact from these notifications, but they're affected by a lot of different factors. And I think actually the hijack case on the far left is most interesting because fixing a compromised website is actually a really tricky technical task. Yet we see the highest response, both in the control group as well as the notified group. So I think when it comes to a very severe security problem, such as these hijacked websites, such as Heartbleed, we actually see a lot stronger response from the notifications. So ultimately, kind of, we get a mixed message here where these notifications do help, but how much they help seem to depend on a lot of the context for the security problem. Throughout these studies, we also looked at different aspects of the notification method. I mentioned all the different variables there. So what did we find was the best way to notify? Well, so when it comes to who to contact, it kind of depends on what's available out there. So in some cases, there are direct channels to the administrators, such as with webmasters. When we were collaborating with Google, they have a product called Search Console that actually has direct contact with administrators. And if you have a direct trusted channel with the administrators, we saw that this could be actually extremely effective. When not, though, public emails that are related to security are particularly helpful. So we actually found across the board that WHOIS abuse emails tended to be the most effective when kind of contacting a public email address there. In terms of what to say in our messages, we saw consistently that detailed messages were most important. There's often, especially when it comes to kind of warnings and such, importance on kind of reducing information, making it simpler. But when we saw what we saw with administrators is that actually providing much more detail is helpful because many administrators are actually quite technical in nature, so they can digest the information, and the detail actually really helps them understand exactly what's going on and how important it is. We did actually experiment with different aspects of the display of the report, and we found that ultimately plain text reports were the most trusted, as well as including references, especially to trusted organizations such as Microsoft or Google references, or references to national kind of policies or national cert kind of information there. So kind of providing as much information that's grounded in kind of trustworthy sources, we found was most effective there. One interesting aspect of these notification kind of constructs was that we found that translating actually was not just not helpful, it actually actively harmed some of our notifications, which we were a little surprised by because we thought this would help overcome some language barriers. But when we engaged with some of the administrators, we actually found out that the reason why these translations actually have a harmful impact is that they make our notifications look suspicious. We, especially for these particular studies, we were notifying mostly from US institutions. So it's really odd as an administrator in another country, such as, let's say, in Spain, to receive a Spanish message from US institutions there. So, and it also turns out because administrators deal with systems that interact globally, most of them are actually quite comfortable with engaging in just English as a default international language there. So we found that translation actually doesn't help when it comes to these notifications. In terms of the timing of notifications, unfortunately, we found that notifying only once was effective because if you notified afterwards, basically people did not actually respond any further. And this largely probably arose because either the notification contact that we had wasn't a good contact to start off with, or even if we did reach an administrator, they had decided that they were not going to fix the problem. So notifying multiple times actually didn't do anything in terms of actually getting more people to fix the problem. All right. And then the final kind of category of results I wanted to very briefly touch on is whether administrators seem to appreciate the notifications, or how did they actually respond to the notification process itself. Like maybe they did fix the problem, but maybe we irritated them in the process. And if so, that brings into question whether we should really be doing these notifications. I'm just going to highlight an example from one study, which is the Heartbleed study. This is actually the first study that we did on security notifications, just because it has kind of concrete numbers. It's kind of hard to aggregate across different studies. So with the Heartbleed study, we notified thousands of administrators. And for the most part, we actually didn't hear back from the vast majority of them. 56 of them did respond to our messages, asking for more information or kind of getting some clarifications. So we did sentiment analysis on these messages, and we found that overall of these 56 respondents, the vast majority were positive. They were thanking us for notifying them, saying that they were going to fix the problem, ultimately appreciating the notification itself. We found several that were neutral, such as just trying to find out more information about who we were. And we had two that were the sentiment analysis classified as negative. But when we actually engaged with these respondents further, it turned out that in the end, they were actually quite happy with the notifications. For example, one of the respondents thought we had made a mistake and was like, no, I'm not actually vulnerable. But when we actually provided more evidence that they're actually vulnerable, they realized that they indeed had systems that remained vulnerable to Heartbleed bug. Another one also was unsure about why we were notifying them, but when we told them about our study and kind of how we were trying to get people to fix the problem, the tone actually changed to positive again. So ultimately, in the end, the overwhelming response to the notifications was positive. And I think it's important to recognize that this is obviously a very heavily skewed response population. But what this does indicate is that even though we did a large-scale notifications, we didn't get a ton of people responding negatively, which might have been the case had we kind of irritated or annoyed a bunch of administrators. So even though we didn't actually get a lot of responses, the lack of responses is a bit of a signal itself. So we sent actually, yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt. So this is about a little bit like, I think you got a lot of questions about that, like both during the paper and after it. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, so as you were mentioning, there is already a bias, right? I mean, the people who are not happy about it, they possibly just kept their mouths shut. Like, they didn't really appreciate, and they were like, I'm just going to ignore. I mean, I don't really care about these guys.
Mhm.
So do you have a sense for, because I mean, the people who are positive, they want to actually, appreciate what you are doing. They actually came back to you, but others might
Mhm.
not be
Mhm.
such appreciated, because what I'm
Mhm.
thinking from even my works also, right? I mean, we are always I'm at least very scared in talking to people, like, cold mail without having a protocol and everything else in place, simply
Mhm.
because people might actually feel this intrusion, which might be unethical for behavioral research and so on. So
Mhm.
how did you handle that?
Yeah, so with this first study, what we did was a smaller scale pilot study first, and we didn't see a large negative response. And so let me back up. So to your point, actually, indeed, we didn't see a lot of responses. So it's very hard for us to actually engage exactly how most of these recipients actually felt. So we
Mhm.
obviously have a huge response bias in who we actually engage with. But I think
Right.
if you actually send out these notifications, if a lot of people are very strongly annoyed, you do actually tend to see strong negative responses, like a lot of people emailing you back, flame wars and things of that nature. And if people are really happy, they send a lot of positive notes. So I think the lack of response actually largely signals a lot
Mm.
of ignorant, like even if it's positive, it's only slightly positive. If it's negative, it's only slightly negative. So kind of the overall signal there is there's not such strong extreme sentiments to cause people to actually push back heavily on this. It is hard, I will say, from this to actually engage kind of like very robustly understand exactly how these respondents actually reacted. So in some subsequent work where we've actually done like interviews and surveys with administrators that was external to the notification, here there's a huge bias because we only reach out to people we already notified. So in some of those separate studies, we do see that in general, these notifications are generally appreciated if they're actually valuable, like they're actually accurate. The concern is when it's like spam or advertisement. That's actually what tends to irritate people there.
I see. No, I think the background for my question is also
Mhm.
the Linux developer, that one, right? I mean, they actually tried to push, at
Mhm.
least try to actually see the wrong patches, and
Mhm.
that attracted serious flack. And I guess that
Mhm.
is one of the reasons that why communities like Kai or
Mhm.
even CCS usability Usenix, like, we are like really, really cautious
Mhm.
while even saying whether something is
Mhm.
ethical or not. So I think
Mhm.
that this is definitely ethical because you're trying to help those people and with the whole earnest effort. But I was just wondering whether how do you even ensure that people are not really taking it negatively?
Yeah,
You
I
possibly.
think that's yeah. So I think so. One thing is all of the contacts that we reach out to, these are public contacts. These are not private contacts that we somehow dug up.
Right.
But these are
Right.
actually public contacts that are actually designed for this purpose. So for example, when we dig out emails, we're explicitly looking for kind of security or technical contacts, not for like
Okay.
other emails
I see.
associated with the organization. So we're
Right.
actually specifically looking for these contacts that like the intention of the contact is this sort of kind of
Nice.
notification there. So ultimately what we're trying to do here is kind of work with the contacts that were set up for this kind of process. But no, I think to your point though, there is a question of, if you were to do this at larger scale, would the sentiments shift? And it's kind of unclear how that would move in the future. I think from the kind of ethical and kind of IRB perspective, this sort of kind of work has been ultimately deemed kind of low risk because you're kind of reaching out to these public contacts kind of designed for this. But of course, if there was larger pushback against these notifications, I think that would be a different story. The thing that
Right.
we've seen repeatedly across these studies is that there's not a
Mhm.
large pushback that, and I think that's actually what
And
kind of supports this, that empirically we've not actually seen a strong reaction, negative reaction to these notifications.
I see. Thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, just to kind of wrap this up. So yeah, we talked to some of the administrators that we notified. We were actually a little surprised that most of them were aware of the problem and had taken some steps to try and fix the problem. That was arguably what I had initially thought would be the biggest advantage of the notifications, like raising awareness. And we did raise awareness at some individuals, but for many of them, the problem was actually that they had either tried to tackle the problem but had not successfully done so, either due to like a distribution responsibility, where because these administrators are part of organizations, there could be many individuals or many different stakeholders involved, and somewhere the vulnerability fixing kind of fell through the gap. And then there's also just issues of incomplete self-diagnosis where they didn't actually realize they were still vulnerable there. So kind of ultimately from these sort of studies, what we've seen repeatedly is that these sort of notifications have been generally well received. We've never seen a large pushback, and we've seen in general quite positive sentiments back, but of course that's kind of skewed. We have seen that we've raised awareness at some of the people that we've contacted, and particularly by giving personalized information. I think this is actually arguably this third point is one of the most valuable parts of these notifications. It's not just that we raise awareness, like there's a lot of news article and media posts about these problems, but by giving personalized information, by telling them that, hey, you have a specific host here, and we can even tell you like these are the specific hosts that are effective, this actually allows them to quickly diagnose the problem and actually take action there. So ultimately, just to kind of wrap up this section, I think the impact of these administrator notification studies have helped shed light on how these outreach efforts actually work in practice. There's evidence that, concrete empirical evidence that this supports positive impact, that this actually gets people to fix problems at scale. We also kind of, through our experiments, figured out kind of different treatments for these notifications. So we have like suggestions for best practices on how to do the notifications. But we ultimately saw that in many cases, our notifications, while they were able to have impact, the impact was relatively small. It was still a minority of folks that actually fixed the problem. So through this body of work, we've actually kind of identified directions for improvement. And I should say, if you looked at the kind of the dates of the works that I mentioned earlier, most of them were actually a little bit older. They actually were mostly during my PhD. And over the last few years, there's actually been a lot of people who've been exploring some of these directions in a little bit more depth. One thing that I like about this body of work is that by just inherently through its nature, it's led to a lot of real world remediation where we've seen thousands of servers out there actually fix security problems. And we've seen that there's actually been adoption across different areas. For example, we've seen in academia, we've seen some researchers either study this or also do notifications on the security problems that they've found. We've seen some industry engagement as well, where especially Google has kind of found the results from the notifications quite promising and have actually expanded it out further into notifying about more problems. And we've also talked a lot with some government agencies or government institutions, such as national certs, on doing notifications for very severe security problems that affect systems within a particular country. All right, so I actually am just going to wrap up there in terms of the notification work. So I thought I'd just briefly pause and see if there were any other questions.
So from audience, any questions? You can raise your hand or just speak up.
If not, I'm happy to keep going on.
All right, let's do that.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry. Sounds good. All right. So I just wanted to highlight a few more recent developments that have been coming from some more recent work. So one of the challenges that I talked about earlier was that in many cases, we actually don't necessarily find a good contact for a host, where the contact, like we send an email, but the email is never received by an actual administrator there. More recently, there's been a proposed standard called security.txt, where websites can actually publish information about vulnerability disclosure. And it's similar to robots.txt and ads.txt. If you're familiar with those, it's just text files that sit on a website that provide information. So in a recent study just at IMC last year, we actually did a measurement of security.txt use in the wild. And we saw that despite the fact that this is a proposed standard, there's actually been a lot of adoption over the last year, especially among kind of big websites and big organizations. But we did see that when it comes to security.txt, there's actually already some discrepancies between real world use of security.txt and the specifications. So in terms of the contacts, like security.txt is a really interesting proposal because it actually provides a very easy way for people to find out how to report security problems. But we saw some discrepancies where people are actually using different sorts of contacts to actually reach out about security problems there. So if anyone actually wants to use security detects in practice, it's important to kind of understand some of these discrepancies. Security detects itself, the information there, we analyzed it, and it actually gives you some interesting lessons for vulnerability disclosure in general. So one thing that we saw is that a lot of organizations actually do support the security at generic email. So if you don't actually have an email contact that you can find for a particular host, security at seems to be at least a decent guess. It doesn't mean that it'll actually be available, but of the generic emails, this one seems to be the best. One thing that we saw that kind of reiterates what we saw in our notification studies was that English is by far the most popular language for disclosure. Like in security detect, you can indicate what languages you would prefer the reports be provided in, and English is pretty much universally supported. We were also surprised to see that many sites actually support encrypted disclosure channels. So there are actually ways where you can send in your vulnerability reports using encryption such that only those recipients will actually be able to get the security problem, the security information, and actually verify that it hasn't been tampered with en route. So I think security.txt is actually a really interesting development, and kind of our study shows that it probably will be an important resource for vulnerability disclosure kind of moving into the future. Another kind of study that we did, and again, this is going to be a very high level overview, is that we actually have done kind of user studies with administrators external to the notification efforts, where we've actually tried to understand their updating process as well as kind of how this is unique compared to end users. So we've actually identified like the different stages of the administrator updating process and found that there's a variety of unique aspects that they have to handle. For example, administrators have to do extensive information gathering, whereas end users actually typically do little to no gathering about updates. They have to deal with a variety of decision factors beyond what end users have to deal with. Like, for example, because they're part of an organization, they have to go through certain administrative workflows. They have to do risk analysis and such. And these are typically things that end users don't do. There's also a very significant testing and backup phase of the updating process because administrators manage so many machines that may be critical to an organization's operations. And the deployment process is usually very complicated. It involves phased rollouts. It requires a lot of kind of human elements such as coordination and communication with stakeholders. And then they also have to deal with kind of fixing problems that might arise due to the updates. And I think this last one was actually particularly interesting because when it comes to updating, oftentimes we think of automatic updates as the solution to everything. If we just rolled out automatic updates, we would solve a lot of security problems because software would be patched very quickly. But we saw that with administrators, there's a very, very strong negative sentiment about automatic updates because they need to maintain their servers, they need to maintain all these systems and ensure that they remain functional. Otherwise, the organization could be severely negatively impacted. So automatic updates are really not an option for them, and they really need to be able to manually control that there. So from this kind of user study, we can more deeply understand the actual process that administrators go through when fixing some of these problems, such as through updating. All right, so just for the sake of time, I was hoping to actually touch on kind of some of the recent work that we've done on authentication. It's been kind of the similar nature, looking at authentication, but rather from the web administrator side. Just for the sake of time, because I see we only have a few minutes left, I'm just gonna kind of give a 2-minute summary of it and then kind of hop to the end. But basically, when it comes to this kind of line of work, recently we've been looking at how web administrators deal with authentication. There's been a ton of work in the research literature about how authentication impacts users, particularly how do users pick passwords, how are different password policies affecting the kinds of passwords that users pick. I'm sure all of you have seen on various kinds of websites, like when you're trying to create an account, it says various things like, oh, your password isn't strong enough, you need to add a character here of a letter or a number, something of that sort. So there's been a lot of work looking at how users interact with these kind of authentication mechanisms. But there's actually been significantly less investigation into what do websites and webmasters actually do with these authentications, and why do they make the kind of authentication decisions that they actually do. So I've got some ongoing work that I'm just going to highlight, and I'm happy to kind of discuss further if anyone wants to. But we've been doing some kind of analysis of what kind of password practices are actually deployed at scale on these sites. Also, there's a lot of kind of developments in the authentication world, and there's kind of state-of-the-art authentication proposals such as FIDO2 that hopefully one day may actually even kind of get rid of passwords. And we've been looking at how that changes the operations at the webmaster side. So for example, a lot of actually risk analysis that's done for logins these days are done using password features. But with FIDO2, that'll be gone. So what do we do then? So we're doing some kind of active collaborations with industry on how FIDO2 changes online account security. We've been doing some user studies with some of these web administrators to understand kind of what their mental models about authentication are and how we can, and kind of why they make the decisions that they do. And we've been doing some work kind of reevaluating some of these authentication mechanisms when you actually think about the wide array of threat models that webmasters actually face. So I was hoping to actually talk about this last one and give an example of a study that we had last year, but just for the sake of time, I thought actually I'd skip through this and actually just jump to kind of my last slide here. So I wanted to wrap up by just kind of giving you what I think is hopefully the takeaway from today's talk. And that's beyond typical end users. I think there's a lot of other subpopulations that are really important to study and really interesting to study from a security and privacy perspective. Today, I've kind of focused on administrators, but I think there's a lot of other populations out there. And I think our community is starting to recognize that and investigate them. And I think this kind of work will really help bring security and privacy to as many individuals out there as possible. I think when it comes to studying security and privacy for these subpopulations, I think it's important to account for a lot of the socio-technical considerations that are in play there. So for example, we can use a variety of methods to understand their behavior as well as why are they behaving the way that they are. So this includes kind of large scale empirical measurements of their behavior, such as through network measurements, as well as kind of user studies, qualitative studies to investigate how these populations or how these users think about security and why they make the decisions that they do. And then based on the data that we actually get, we can do data-driven or empirically grounded solutions that will actually fit them. Rather than making assumptions about how they behave, we can actually be driven by actual evidence of their behavior there. So hopefully, you can, the kind of high level takeaway here is that I think there's a lot of interesting work to do out there in security and privacy for all of these populations. And there's a lot of different interesting empirical methods that can be leveraged in doing so. So I'll wrap up there by saying thank you everyone for taking part of your Friday to attend this talk. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks a ton for the fantastic talk. Right. So question time. Please, audience, please unmute yourself, ask questions.
Thanks, Frank, for the nice talk. So I'm not aware of all these usability issues and things like that. But like I have one question, like you mentioned about this FIDO2 and this that is going to change everything. So can you just give me like some idea, like what is that? I don't have any idea about that. So that's why I'm wondering.
Okay, yeah. So essentially, we as a community, we really well recognize the limitations of passwords. People pick weak passwords. They don't provide too much security. They have all sorts of usability problems with people forgetting passwords and stuff like that. But passwords are still here because ultimately they're the best kind of solution that we have. They're the most usable of everything we can come up with. But in the last few years, there's been a development called FIDO, where it's actually a little bit complicated. So I won't go into the details, but at a very high level, FIDO is basically about replacing passwords with having kind of like, say, for example, some user device that you can log in with. So having kind of trusted hardware that's associated with a user that you can use to log in. So this is actually kind of getting rid of a lot of the usability problems as well as a lot of the security problems. Like FIDO actually has been kind of theoretically analyzed to provide a lot of really nice properties. But when we do deploy FIDO, because passwords wouldn't be around anymore, you actually get very different operating modes when it comes to online security. Like, for example, a lot of defenses use password features like how do people type, how quickly do they type, things like that, to understand if this is a real human or not, or kind of what is this a risky login? And we kind of lose that with FIDO.
Okay. So it's some kind of hardware token. So you just distribute that to everyone and they can use that to access those websites. Is it something like that?
So that's one operating mode. The reason why it's complex is FIDO is actually designed to be, they want it to be adopted. So there's a lot of different operating modes. So this includes, for example, facial recognition, uses fingerprint, using hardware tokens. So FIDO 2 actually has a broad set of operating modes. And that's actually what I think makes it kind of challenging from the webmaster perspective. Like, because you have all of these different operating modes, if you're going to build a risk model for, is this login the real user or someone else? There's actually, I think it becomes a lot more complex there.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, great question.
Yep. Other questions?
Yeah, I mean, hello, sir. I mean, do we have any solutions where we want to address this security of administrators at the hardware end? Maybe developing some secure boot systems in the chip itself.
Let me just reiterate the question to make sure I understood. I think you were asking, are there like really good solutions for just providing security in general for the administrators? Are you thinking specifically for the authentication problem or something different?
Yeah, I mean, maybe for any remote attacks that you can launch against any remote attacks that you can launch on your system.
I mean, I think ultimately secure hardware. So one, I think there's a lot of problems with actually building secure hardware in the first place. Over the last few years, we have found that basically any system that we build that we think is secure in hardware, there's side channel attacks, there's all sorts of attacks that can actually be launched. So I'll say that in practice, I don't think we actually have really good hardware solutions to start off with. But even if we did, I think a lot of these problems ultimately don't boil down only to hardware solutions. Like, for example, with patching, this is like, there is a problem in the software. We need to update it. And, some hardware module there, I don't think is going to be the solution in terms of if it automatically does the update. We know that updates can have problems. So this can cause kind of disruption at the organization. When it comes to other sorts of problems, I think a lot of them just can't be boiled down to a trusted environment in the hardware solution. I think there's a subset of security problems that can be, but in general, security tends not to be solvable with kind of a single trusted technical solution like that. Not sure if that totally answers your question, though.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
So
and also just introduce. So just introduce yourself once. I think Satyajit did, and if possible, just switch on your video. You are remote, but Any case, go ahead, please.
Video might be a bit problematic for me. Hi, Frank. I am Shubham. I'm a passing out student from IIT KGP from the computer science department only. So my question is regarding your vulnerability notification studies that you showed. So is any of the system like in production now, like currently giving out notifications to system administrators? Because what I feel is that if you are sending notifications for a specific vulnerability, people might take heed. But if you are sending out vulnerabilities, let's say every once in a while, like in 1 day or 2 days, the 0 days vulnerabilities are exposed, and if you are keeping sending notifications, people might start ignoring them. So.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. And that's actually one of the big questions that this whole space doesn't really have an answer to. So we see in real user warnings, end user warnings, notification fatigue or warning fatigue is a very real effect. When it comes to these kind of administrator notifications, I would imagine if you had notifications happening, like every day, you would definitely have fatigue as well. The thing is, like, none of this is actually happening at that scale yet, so we don't have any empirical data on this. But I would say, I think notifications ultimately, and kind of one of the conclusions from this body of work, at least that I draw from it, is that there are severe problems that you should notify about, but then less severe problems that are not very effective to notify about. For example, misconfigurations tend not to actually see a large notification response. So in such cases, I would say that if we were to do large notifications at scale, we should actually do them for only like the most severe events. So hopefully you would actually only get them now and then. I also mentioned that when we actually did our user study with administrators, we do see that they suffer from some information overload where, there's thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities found every year. Every week there's tons of software being updated. So there is actually kind of like an overwhelming amount of stuff happening. So notifications, I think, would need to be carefully rolled out so that you kind of notify about the most important things there so that you don't actually send too much noise out there to the administrators.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Any other questions? I actually have a couple.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Like due to your fantastic talk, but I'll just wait if others have any questions first. Okay, so two primary questions actually, and this related to your work and partially like my line of work also. So one is that, so it is on the building on Shubham's question, right? I mean, the thing is that in GDPR or in CCPA, I mean, all these regulations actually put some effort, like real effort, in putting some legal restrictions on web administrators. Like they have some responsibilities now. So do you have a sense, like in any of your work, like with Marshini or others, do you have any sense that whether they are doing anything to actually abide by with those regulations or, it's just there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'll say first, one, GDPR and CCP have been a really interesting development. And they're actually happened like essentially after like all of the notification work that I talked about today was actually predates them, which is unfortunate because, like, for example, I mentioned who is contacts was very valuable in our studies. GDPR has actually made who is much less valuable these days. So I think there's some interesting work that could be done on just, how does GDPR and CCPA affect some of the results from the previous studies. But that's kind of like a side comment there. Towards your main comment about, or your main question about administrators adhering to GDPR. So I've not studied this too much directly. I will say there's been a number of studies looking at how people have adopted the policies of GDPR and CCPA, more GDPR, I should say. And I think the adoption has been, it's kind of been mixed. It's like on one hand, certain things have gone overboard. Like I'm sure a lot of you have seen the website banners where you have to say, I accept these cookies or not. But then there's a lot of aspects that, especially if they're hard to externally monitor, have been adopted a lot less. With kind of like our user studies with administrators, we see that compliance is actually one of the major, things they try and adhere to. But a lot of this actually comes from management. So usually a lot of organizations will actually have compliance like officers who are in charge of making sure that the organization is in compliance. But smaller organizations usually don't have that. So we actually see like an array of adoption where some people actually think that they're complying, but they're actually not. Other people have no idea about some of this stuff. And then other people actually put a lot of effort into it. So I think you see quite an array. You do see people responding to them, but I think the level of response kind of varies.
Right. I mean, so just a sub question or sub comment to that. You're absolutely right. There is quite a bit of work on GDPR, specifically on third-party tracking and basically like so cookie banners and so on. We did some work on the right to forget, on the deletion privacy and all these things, right? But I think this particular thing is like, we are talking about keeping the data secure, which is very different than, tracking, stopping tracking, because that actually requires more active involvement of the administrator. Like you need to actually patch every single time, because if the data is lost, then it is your responsibility. You have to really protect the data right way. So I actually thought that might be really interesting to talk to them, like after GDPR or CCPA, where there's a real possibility they can go to jail if they fail due to some miscommunication, something like, they didn't really understand and they actually lose some sensitive data. If someone sues, they might actually go to prison. So that might be that might be interesting to look into.
I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. I will say, I imagine that these are effective to only some extent still, because I think with compliance, there's ultimately, there's what's policy and then there's what's actually enforced. And I think enforcement is actually the ultimate driver of behavior here, where I think, like, for example, in the US, we have a lot of, like, if you, for example, are doing any business with the government, with the US government, you actually have to follow certain compliance requirements with your systems. And most people know about them and follow them generally, but the enforcement of kind of like non-compliance is relatively low, even if there are technically high consequences. So I think that results in a lot of kind of gaps in the behavior there, where you kind of sort of comply, but not quite. So I think it would be interesting. I don't know how GDPR and CCPA have affected people. But I suspect that the effect will still be somewhat muted until we see very large enforcement, kind of widespread enforcement, I should say.
I agree. I think, I mean, I would agree with you, but it will be still an interesting question, because I actually believe people will just install some softwares at the very least and just keep it there. But what softwares did they install, and whether they are doing the right thing, or if there is any recipe for them to actually follow, that will be good. My second comment / question is on, I would say, more pen testing, because you're talking about these folks who are possibly more technically literate than the general populace, and they have a responsibility to deliver anyways. Whether they use pen testing and fuzzing and all this more, these are not advanced anymore. I would say these are like running tools right now. Whether they do that on their own products to actually find, or basically services to find vulnerabilities, like what, how does the ground data look?
Yeah, I think actually, while we know that certain organizations, especially like really large technical, tech companies, do this, I would actually say overall, I've seen very few people use these kind of techniques that we use in the academic work a lot in terms of research. Fuzzing, very few people are familiar. Well, they might have heard of fuzzing before, but no one's like really using it to evaluate their own software. A lot of these pen testing tools are usually not being used. We do see some administrators as part of organizations where they hire consultants to, do red team testing and whatnot. But overall, actually, this is where I think there's an interesting avenue for research, where I think if we were to try and have these administrators use more technically complex solutions, I think they could in many cases, where like we can't ask an average end user to possibly do some of this stuff. It's not clear if actually administrators will be very effective at it, but I think there's at least some hope there that they can use more technically involved solutions. But so far, I don't think they use that many. A lot of what they do, they might understand the technical details a lot more, but I don't think they're actually using whole new classes of solutions that compared to, like, say, end users.
Understood. Yeah, I mean, that might be something interesting system development there, because it also seems there's might be a usability challenge, like usability problem for the tools. Those are available today. Just to
yeah, okay. Definitely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting research that could be done there.
Okay. So thanks.
Okay. I had one question.
Yeah,
yes,
go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, nowadays multi-factor authentication, I mean, this has been advocated as, one of the security standards. It's one of the primary compliance requirements. So would you like to highlight or cite some limitations of this?
You mean limitations of multi-factor authentication, or like how this is affecting administrators?
Maybe of two-factor authentication.
Yeah, so two-factor authentication definitely, hardens authentication. I actually am not too aware of any, at least in the US, there are actually not that many like requirements that you have to have two-factor authentication, which is why we see actually still somewhat limited adoption. I actually think a lot of the progress that we've seen in the last few years about 2FA have come through the industry side. Like, for example, we've got companies like Duo, Google has kind of rolled out their own products and such. That have made two-factor authentication a lot easier for a lot of organizations to handle. And I think that just makes it, that's kind of why we've seen a lot more adoption there. I think with 2FA, I haven't studied 2FA directly myself, but I think that it's, so from the end user side, there's certainly a kind of, it provides more security, but it introduces some usability kind of issues, as well as kind of like higher burden on the user. On the administrator side, I'm kind of somewhat hypothesizing here because I haven't ever kind of talked with administrators systematically about 2FA, but I think it also does complicate their authentication workflow. So I think there's some hesitancy on their part to kind of deal with that. We do in general see that anything that involves a major technical change to infrastructure often causes problems for administrators, whether it's like the administrator themselves might advocate for changing it, but then when it comes to like say management, do they support kind of such a big shift? We see kind of more human elements that can be challenges there. So I think with 2FA, I think it's obviously a very good security scheme that can help harden authentication, but we see a number of challenges in terms of it actually rolling out in practice.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Any other questions? Last call. Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Frank. This is
No,
fantastic.
Thank you. And yeah, I was happy to talk with folks at IIT Kharagpur. So thank you for having me. It was a great opportunity to meet you all and talk for today.
And Frank, would you mind sharing the slides with us? We'll just post it on the website along with the recording of this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can send it to you over email after the talk.
Thank you so much.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, thank you everyone then.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, take care. Bye, folks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.